Have you ever felt like anxiety makes you question your worth? Like you're constantly second-guessing yourself, even when nothing is really wrong? Or maybe you notice that the more anxious you feel, the more critical you become of yourself, and the harder it is to feel confident in even the simplest situations. Do you ever walk away from a conversation replaying everything you said, wondering if you sounded awkward, or if the other person noticed how anxious you felt? Welcome back to Quieting Anxiety. I'm Dr. Monica Frank with Excel at Life. Today we're exploring something that may not seem obvious at first, but once you understand it, it can change the way you think about anxiety. I want to talk about self-esteem. Specifically, how the way you see yourself contributes to your anxiety, and how anxiety in turn can wear down your self-esteem. Before we begin, let's take a moment to center with a brief exercise. You can do this sitting or lying down, whatever feels comfortable. Close your eyes and imagine standing in front of a large blackboard. On that blackboard are the words you often say to yourself, those automatic thoughts that come up when you're anxious. Maybe they say, "I can't handle this," or "I'm not good enough." Take a moment to visualize those words written clearly. Now, in your mind's eye, pick up an eraser and begin to wipe them away, slowly, deliberately. As each word disappears, notice the feeling of release. With the board cleared, imagine writing something new in its place, something more supportive, more grounded, more rational. Maybe, "I'm learning to handle this," or "I don't have to be perfect to be valuable." Take a breath, and when you're ready, gently bring your attention back to this moment. We often think of anxiety as something that just happens to us, like a storm that blows in and throws us off course. But part of the intensity of that storm depends on how solid your foundation is, and that foundation is often your sense of self. Let's take a moment to talk about self-esteem and how it relates to anxiety. If you struggle with low self-esteem, you're not alone. In fact, research shows that between 50 and 90% of people with anxiety disorders also report having low self-esteem, especially those with social anxiety where the rates are particularly high. That means it's incredibly common to have self-doubt or feel like you're not good enough when you're living with anxiety. What's really interesting is that the relationship between self-esteem and anxiety goes both ways. It's not just that the anxiety makes you feel bad about yourself. It's also that feeling bad about yourself can make anxiety worse. A major research review looked at nearly 100 studies and found that low self-esteem predicts future anxiety. In other words, if you're constantly telling yourself you're not capable or not worthy, your brain is more likely to perceive situations as threatening, even if they're not. You might second-guess yourself, worry more, or avoid things altogether because you expect to fail or be judged. And unfortunately, that avoidance only reinforces the anxiety. At the same time, anxiety can damage your self-esteem. When you feel anxious, you might stumble over words, avoid eye contact, or feel like your body is betraying you. Then you judge yourself harshly for those symptoms, calling yourself weak or awkward or incapable. And that judgment sinks into how you see yourself, leading to even lower self-worth. For example, if you believe you're not socially competent, you're more likely to assume people are judging you, even when they aren't. If you think you're unworthy, a neutral glance from someone might feel like rejection. If you don't trust your own judgment, uncertainty becomes overwhelming. That's how low self-esteem fuels anxiety. But it goes the other way too. When you live with anxiety, You often experience moments where your body reacts in ways that feel out of your control: racing heart, shaking hands, frozen speech. Those symptoms can feel humiliating or make you feel helpless. And if they show up when you're trying to do something important, or even during everyday activities, you might begin to internalize those moments as evidence that you're weak or broken or incapable. This dynamic can play out in many anxiety disorders, not just social anxiety. If you have generalized anxiety disorder, your self-esteem may be tied to a fear of making mistakes or not being good enough at managing every possible outcome. With panic disorder, you might internalize physical symptoms of panic as a sign that you're weak or damaged, rather than recognizing them as treatable physiological responses. People with PTSD often carry deep shame about their reactions or the event itself, believing there is something wrong with them or they're somehow at fault. And if you live with OCD, you may feel defective because of the thoughts you have or the compulsive behaviors you engage in. This is why it can feel like a loop you can't escape. Low self-esteem fuels anxiety, and anxiety chips away at your confidence. But understanding this pattern is a step toward changing it. So in today's episode, we're going to explore how to break this cycle, how to begin strengthening your sense of worth, even when anxiety tells you not to trust yourself. You don't have to eliminate all your self-doubt to feel better. You just need to learn how to respond to it differently. When you struggle with low self-esteem, it can make anxiety feel even more overwhelming. You may start to believe that you don't have what it takes to handle the anxiety or make meaningful changes. Instead of viewing challenges as problems to solve, you might see them as confirmation of your inadequacy. This sense of helplessness can become a barrier to using the very tools that could help. Because if you don't believe in your ability to succeed, why even try? Low self-esteem doesn't just intensify anxious thoughts, it can undermine your motivation and hope for improvement. That's why building a stronger, more compassionate sense of self is so important in managing anxiety effectively. But the good news is, it's a cycle that can be interrupted. Let's look at how low self-esteem might show up in everyday life across different types of anxiety. You might apologize constantly, even when nothing is your fault, because you're afraid of making mistakes or being seen as irresponsible. You may dismiss compliments, telling yourself they don't really mean it, or they don't know the real me, because accepting anything positive feels unearned. You might avoid decisions or ask for constant reassurance, not because you lack intelligence, but because you don't trust your judgment. Maybe you go out of your way to avoid situations that trigger anxiety, like driving, going to the store, or having certain thoughts, because you believe you're too fragile to cope. You might ruminate endlessly about what you said, what you did, whether you locked the door, or whether your body's sensations mean something is terribly wrong. All of this comes from a basic sense of uncertainty about your worth and your capacity to handle life. And when that uncertainty is your starting point, daily experiences, interactions, sensations, memories, thoughts can become constant tests. And when something feels difficult or unresolved, it can seem like a personal failure, reinforcing the fear that you're not good enough, not capable, or not safe. This constant self-monitoring creates anxiety, and the more anxious you feel, the more you retreat inward and reinforce those beliefs. So what can you do? It's not about magically believing in yourself or repeating that you're amazing. It's about building a different kind of self-relationship, one that's realistic, compassionate, and action-based. And that starts with changing how you respond to yourself, not how you feel about yourself. Let me explain. A lot of people believe they have to feel better about themselves before they can act differently. If I felt more confident, I'd speak up. If I weren't so anxious, I'd go to the store alone. If I trusted myself more, I wouldn't keep checking things. If I believed I could handle it, I'd stop avoiding that memory. But in cognitive behavioral therapy, we reverse that process. We don't wait to feel better to act. We act our way into feeling better. That might mean you go for a walk even if your thoughts are racing. You sit with the discomfort of uncertainty instead of seeking reassurance. You stick to your planned schedule even when your body is flooded with anxiety. You resist the urge to avoid or escape and instead take one small step forward, even if your heart is pounding. Now, obviously, as I've talked about before, these steps need to be taken in a calculated way. But these small, courageous actions send your brain new messages. I can tolerate this. I'm stronger than I thought. I don't have to be perfect to take action. Over time, those messages become part of how you see yourself. And as your self-image strengthens, your anxiety begins to lose some of its grip. One of the biggest mistakes people with low self-esteem make is defining their worth based on how in control they feel or how much anxiety they're experiencing. You might think, if I were strong, I wouldn't feel this way. If I can't manage this, something must be wrong with me. If I keep having panic attacks or intrusive thoughts, I must be broken. But those conclusions aren't fair or accurate. Anxiety is a normal human response that sometimes becomes overactive. It doesn't define your value, and it doesn't mean you can't still live with purpose and courage. In fact, it takes courage to do what you are doing right now, learning how to manage your anxiety. So instead of measuring your worth by how anxious you feel or how others react to you, begin to build an internal guide that reflects your resilience. One that says, this is who I am, these are my values, this is how I choose to respond even when things are hard. That's when your self-esteem becomes less reactive, more grounded, and much more protective against anxiety. This is a particularly important topic, so be sure to reflect upon your self-concept and how it affects you. If you are using the Quieting Anxiety app, you can take the What is Your Self-Concept test to help understand the different aspects of your self-concept. If you find that these issues affect you, this episode may involve a great deal of homework. That's okay. As we've discussed before, it is important to take the time you need for this journey. So it may be beneficial for you to take a break from these episodes and instead focus on the more specific tools in my 20 Steps to Better Self-Esteem audio series. It offers short, focused steps that walk you through the practical skills for developing a more stable, confident, and compassionate self-image, one that helps reduce anxiety over time. In addition, I have 2 guided rational thinking audios that help you consolidate what you've learned and continue changing the self-talk that contributes to low self-esteem. The first is Self-Esteem Blackboard. In this audio, similar to the exercise in this podcast, you'll use visualization to write your negative self-talk on a blackboard, erase it, and replace it with more positive, rational responses. This process reinforces the cognitive skills you've been learning, giving you hands-on practice with shifting your internal dialogue in a kinder, more realistic direction. The second is Self-Esteem Train, a guided visualization that takes you on a mental train ride through your life. As you pass different events from your past, you'll have the opportunity to change how you talk to yourself about those experiences, transforming self-criticism into self-compassion and rational thinking. You can't change the past, but you can change your self-talk. And that shift can reduce the impact those past events have on how you see yourself today. If you have had past trauma, it may be best to use this audio under the guidance of a therapist. Together, these two audios can help you feel more capable of changing your situation and managing your anxiety by changing the thoughts that shape how you see yourself. And it's often necessary, as with many of the cognitive audios, to listen to them repeatedly to help make the changes more automatic. Let's finish this episode the way we began, with a brief focus exercise. Close your eyes again. Imagine that same blackboard you saw earlier. Notice what's written on it now. Are there any leftover thoughts from today's episode? Critical thoughts, self-doubt, fear? Once again, pick up that eraser, clear the board, word by word. Choose just one phrase to write in its place, something you want to take with you into the rest of your day. Something encouraging, grounded, maybe I'm learning, or I can grow. Take a breath, let that thought settle in. Keep in mind that when you stop treating yourself as the enemy and start becoming your own ally, anxiety doesn't stand a chance. Until next time, keep practicing, keep breathing, and keep moving forward.